At 1:52 a.m., a waitress returned a wallet worth more than her tuition and learned that men like David Brandon never lose anything by accident. Meet Sandra Williams, a 2-3-year-old nursing student grinding through double shifts at a neon-lit diner where dreams go to die slowly, one refill at a time. Her nights stretch past 2 a.m., her textbooks smell like fryer grease, and her mother's hospital bills sit in a drawer she can't bear to open. She's practical, principled, and one emergency away from losing everything she's worked for. It's 1:45 a.m. The diner hums under flickering chrome and rain-slick windows. Sandra wipes down the counter, already rehearsing tomorrow's anatomy exam in her head, when she notices the man in booth 7, the one who ordered black coffee he never touched, tipped a crisp $100 bill, and left the air feeling heavier after he walked out. David Brandon. Tailored black blazer, open collar, intricate tattoos climbing his neck to frame a gold cross pendant that catches the light like a warning. His face is carved from quiet authority. His silence commands more respect than most people's words. He didn't eat, didn't linger, just watched. Clearing his booth, Sandra's hand brushes something wedged deep in the vinyl seat, a matte black wallet, sleek, expensive, unnervingly deliberate. Inside, a thick stack of hundreds, a blank metal access card, and a minimalist business card with one name, David. Her rent is 3 weeks overdue. Her mother's care facility sent another payment reminder. The cash in her hand could solve both problems tonight. But her grandmother's voice rises from memory. There's no peace in stolen comfort, baby. You sleep soundest on your own dime. Sandra closes the wallet with trembling fingers. She picks up the greasy diner phone and dials the number embossed in gold. 2:15 a.m., one ring. A voice like controlled thunder answers, "You found it." Not a question, a confirmation, as if he'd been waiting. "Yes, sir," Sandra says, her pulse hammering. "I wanted to return it to you." A pause, no hesitation, calculation. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't open it again. Don't call anyone." The line goes dead. 8 minutes later, headlights bloom against the diner window. Harsh, white, surgical. A black sedan glides to the curb. The driver steps out. No uniform, no expression, just efficient silence. He enters, extends a gloved hand for the wallet, and places a plain manila envelope on the counter in exchange. Sandra opens it. Inside, $5,000 in sequential bills and a cardstock note with one word in embossed ink, noted. No signature. No thank you. Just a ledger entry. The driver leaves. The car vanishes into the rain-slick dark. Sandra stands alone under the neon buzz, staring at the envelope, understanding with cold clarity that she hasn't just returned a wallet. She's been filed. Her honesty wasn't rewarded, it was recorded. Her integrity just became her dossier. And somewhere across the city, David Brandon has already decided what that file is worth. Sandra Williams' life was measured in coffee refills and canceled dreams. Her nights were long, her sleep brief, and her hope stretched thinner than her diner apron. At 23, she had mastered the art of survival through exhaustion. Her days were a carefully choreographed dance between lectures on human anatomy, clinical rotations that left her feet screaming, and double shifts at Rosie's Diner, a chrome and neon relic on the edge of downtown where the city's insomniacs, drifters, and night workers converged under flickering fluorescent tubes. The diner smelled perpetually of burnt coffee, grease, and the kind of hope that only blooms at 2 a.m. when nowhere else will take you in. Sandra was practical. She had to be. Her mother's assisted living facility sent invoices she couldn't ignore, and her nursing school tuition sat in a payment plan that felt more like indentured servitude. She kept her natural hair pulled back in a tight, functional bun, wore minimal makeup, and had learned to smile through the ache in her arches and the weight pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't dream of luxury. She dreamed of stability, a world where she didn't have to choose between textbooks and groceries. It was 1:45 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, which is to say, it felt like a slow erosion of time and energy. The city outside breathed in sirens and the soft hiss of rain against pavement. Inside, the diner hummed with the low buzz of aged electrical wiring and the rhythmic drip of a coffee maker that had seen better decades. Sandra wiped down the counter with a damp rag, her mind already running through the pharmacology quiz she had in 6 hours. The diner was nearly empty. A trucker nursed his third cup of black coffee in the corner booth. An older woman with a paperback sat near the window, her eyes glazed with the fatigue of someone who no longer sleeps well. And then there was booth 7. The man in booth 7 was different. He had arrived just after midnight, moving through the door with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need announcement. He was striking in a way that made people look twice, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence rearranged the air around him. Tailored black blazer, crisp even at this ungodly hour, open at the collar to reveal an intricate lattice of tattoos that climbed his neck and disappeared beneath the fabric. A gold cross pendant rested against the ink, catching the diner's dim light like a small, deliberate flame. David Brandon, though Sandra didn't know his name yet, had sharp features, dark eyes that tracked everything without seeming to move, and a stillness that felt almost predatory. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't make small talk when she brought him his order. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He hadn't touched it. He'd simply sat there for 30 minutes, his gaze occasionally drifting to the rain-streaked window, his fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a folded $100 bill under the saucer, a tip worth more than Sandra made in a full shift, and walked out without a word. The diner felt hollower after he left, as if his departure had created a vacuum. Sandra exhaled slowly, pocketed the tip with a whispered thank you to no one in particular, and began clearing his table. She stacked the untouched coffee cup, wiped the ring of condensation, and reached to smooth the cracked red vinyl seat. Her fingers brushed something solid. Wedged deep between the seat cushion and the wall was a wallet, sleek, matte black, and unnervingly perfect. The leather was supple, expensive, the kind that aged beautifully and cost more than her monthly rent. It felt heavy in her hand, substantial, like it carried more than just cards and cash. Sandra slid into the booth and opened it carefully. Inside, there were no grocery receipts, no crumpled lottery tickets, no detritus of a normal life, just precision. 2 thick bundles of crisp $100 bills, held together by a brushed steel clip. An unmarked metal card, gunmetal gray, with no bank logo or magnetic stripe, just a faint engraving she couldn't quite make out. And a single business card, minimalist in design, embossed with one name in small, elegant type, David. Beneath it, a phone number in gold ink. Sandra's pulse quickened. She did the math without meaning to. At least $4,000, maybe more. That was 2 semesters of tuition. That was her mother's overdue facility payment. That was the used car she needed to stop taking 2 buses to campus in the rain. That was breathing room, real breathing room, for the first time in years. The wallet sat in her lap like a loaded question. Her rent was 3 weeks overdue. The notice had been taped to her door that morning, pink and insistent. Her mother's care coordinator had left 2 voicemails about the outstanding balance. Sandra's financial aid disbursement was delayed again. The cash in her hands could solve every problem that kept her awake at night. But her grandmother's voice rose in her mind, clear and unshakable, the way it always did when temptation whispered too loudly. There's no peace in stolen comfort, baby. You sleep soundest on your own dime. Grandma Rose had raised her in a cramped Southside apartment with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that clanged like a ghost. She'd worked 2 jobs, kept Sandra fed and clothed, and never once bent the rules. Integrity isn't negotiable, she used to say. It's the only thing they can't take from you. Sandra closed the wallet with a firm snap. She had to return it. But this wasn't a simple lost item. The sheer amount of cash, the unmarked card, the man's cold, calculated demeanor, it all suggested something far more deliberate. She wouldn't trust Lenny, the night manager, whose eyes already lingered too long on the tip jar. Mailing it felt absurd, unsafe. The only option was the number on the card. Sandra walked behind the counter, her palms damp, and picked up the old rotary-style diner phone. The receiver was sticky with years of use, the coiled cord frayed. She dialed the number printed in gold. It was 2:15 a.m. The phone rang once. A voice answered, low, steady, controlled. No surprise, no warmth. You found it. Not a question. A statement of fact. Sandra swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. Yes, sir. I just wanted to return it. A pause, not hesitation. Evaluation. Stay where you are. Do not open it again. Do not call anyone. The line went dead. Sandra stared at the receiver, her heart hammering against her ribs. The instruction had been absolute. The tone had been calm but edged with something she couldn't name. Control, expectation, certainty. 8 minutes later, headlights flared through the diner's front window, harsh and white, cutting through the rain like surgical beams. A black sedan, sleek and anonymous, glided to the curb. No rideshare decal, no company markings, just dark glass and silent authority. The driver stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a nondescript dark suit. His face was impassive, professional, the kind of face you forget the moment you look away. He entered the diner without acknowledging the other customers, walked directly to Sandra, and extended a gloved hand. She handed him the wallet. He took it, inspected it briefly, then reached into his jacket and withdrew a plain manila envelope. He placed it on the counter in front of her, gave a single nod, and turned to leave. Wait, Sandra said. What? But he was already gone. The sedan pulled away, tail lights dissolving into the rain-slicked dark. Sandra opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, a stack of $100 bills, neatly banded. She counted quickly, $5,000. Beneath the cash, a small cardstock note, embossed in black ink. Noted. No signature, no explanation. Just acknowledgement. Sandra stood alone under the flickering neon, staring at the envelope, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. She hadn't just returned a wallet, she'd been cataloged. Her honesty hadn't been rewarded, it had been recorded, filed, logged into some invisible ledger kept by a man who didn't lose things by accident. The fluorescent tube above her head buzzed and flickered. The rain drummed softly against the windows. Sandra looked down at the note again, her reflection ghostly in the chrome countertop. Noted. Her integrity had just become her dossier. And somewhere across the city, David Brandon had already decided what that file was worth. The neon sign outside buzzed one final time and went dark. 3 weeks passed like a slow exhale. Sandra tried to return to normal, to the rhythm of double shifts and late-night study sessions, to the mechanical comfort of routine. She told herself the envelope had been a strange reward for doing the right thing, nothing more. She paid her rent. She made a payment toward her mother's care facility. She bought new textbooks without checking her account balance first. For the first time in years, she could breathe without calculating the cost. But normal felt like a costume that no longer fit. She felt watched. It started as a whisper at the edge of her awareness, a prickle at the base of her skull that made her glance over her shoulder on empty streets. The same black SUV appeared too many times to be coincidence. Parked across from her campus on Tuesday mornings, idling near the bus stop on Thursday evenings, always at a distance, always with tinted windows that reflected her own nervous face back at her. She saw the same man twice. Once at the campus coffee cart, standing 3 people behind her in line, his face bland and forgettable, until she realized she'd seen it before. The second time at the hospital during her clinical rotation, walking past the nurse's station with a visitor badge that looked too new. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't need to. His presence was the message. Sandra told herself she was being paranoid. Exhaustion and stress could make shadows into threats. But the feeling never left, and the SUV kept appearing, a dark punctuation mark in the margin of her days. It was a Thursday evening, late enough that the college library had emptied to a handful of desperate procrastinators and one exhausted nursing student. Sandra sat at a corner table on the 3rd floor, her anatomy textbook open, her notes scattered like debris from a shipwreck. The overhead lights hummed softly. Outside, the city glowed through tall windows, distant and indifferent. She looked up to stretch her neck and froze. David Brandon stood on the other side of the table. No announcement, no footsteps, just presence, solid and undeniable. as if he'd been standing there the entire time and she'd only just noticed. He wore a different suit, charcoal gray this time, but the same open collar, the same tattoos climbing his neck like ancient script, the same gold cross pendant catching the sterile library light. His eyes were unreadable, calm as still water. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just stood there, waiting, as if he had all the time in the world and she was the one late to an appointment she hadn't known she'd made. Sandra's mouth went dry, her hand stilled on the page. The library suddenly felt too quiet, too exposed. There were no guards, no entourage, no drivers in dark suits, just David Brandon and the weight of his attention. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat with deliberate slowness, his movements precise, unhurried. "You returned my wallet," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past their table. "Most wouldn't. That interests me." Sandra swallowed. "I did what anyone should do," she managed. David tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a jeweler might study a stone under lamplight. "Most people don't. Most people see opportunity and take it. You saw opportunity and called me instead." He paused. "That tells me something." Sandra felt her pulse in her throat. "What does it tell you?" "That you have principles." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim manila folder, placing it on the table between them with the care of someone laying down a winning hand. "And principles, Miss Williams, are either a strength or a liability. It depends on who's holding the leash." Her full name, spoken aloud in his calm, deliberate voice, sent a chill down her spine. She hadn't given it to him. He opened the folder. Inside was a printout of her college transcript, every grade, every course, her student ID number printed at the top. Beneath it, a hospital admission summary with her mother's name, diagnosis, facility address, and outstanding balance highlighted in yellow. Beneath that, a credit report with her rent arrears, her loan balances, the exact total of every debt she carried. Sandra's hands curled into fists on the table. "How did you get this?" David didn't answer the question. He simply looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You want to help people," he said. "I help those who help me. It's a simple economy. What do you want from me?" Sandra's voice was steadier than she felt. David leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. "I want to pay your tuition. All of it. I want to clear your mother's hospital debt. I want to make sure you never have to choose between textbooks and rent again." He paused. "In exchange, you answer a phone when it rings. You perform tasks as instructed, and you speak of it to no one." Sandra's breath caught. What kind of tasks? The kind that required discretion and competence. David's tone was matter-of-fact, almost gentle. Think of it as community service. The faintest trace of irony flickered at the edge of his mouth, gone before she could be sure it was there. He reached into his jacket again and withdrew a small, sleek phone. It was black, featureless, no brand logo, no buttons except a power switch. Just a smooth glass surface with a single white dot in the center, dormant and waiting. He slid it across the table. "You will not call me," he said. "I will call you. And when I do, you'll be mine for those minutes." Sandra stared at the phone. It looked harmless, almost elegant, but it felt like a collar. Her mind raced through the implications, the risks, the sheer enormity of what he was offering and what he was asking in return. Her mother's face rose in her memory, pale and tired in the assisted living facility, asking Sandra not to worry, telling her everything would be fine even as the bills piled up and the care coordinator's calls grew more insistent. "What if I say no?" Sandra asked. David didn't blink. "Then you say no. I'm not in the business of forcing people. But the offer expires when I leave this table." Sandra looked at the phone. She looked at the folder with her life dissected into printouts and highlighted balances. She thought about the black SUV, the man at the coffee cart, the feeling of being cataloged and filed long before this conversation ever started. He'd already decided she was worth the investment. The only question was whether she'd agree to the terms. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone. It was cold against her palm, heavier than it looked. "Okay," she whispered. David stood, smoothing his jacket with one hand. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't smile, just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, as if a contract had been signed in invisible ink. As he turned to leave, Sandra found her voice again. Who are you really? David paused, glancing back over his shoulder. The gold cross caught the light, a small, bright point in the dim library. Someone who never loses things, he said. I only leave them for people worth finding. Then he was gone, his footsteps silent on the library carpet, leaving Sandra alone with a phone that felt like a countdown timer and a choice that couldn't be unmade. She looked down at the white dot, dormant and patient, and wondered how long she'd have to wait before it lit up and claimed the minutes she'd just sold. Outside, the city hummed. The black SUV pulled away from the curb, and Sandra Williams sat in the fluorescent silence, holding a phone that would decide whether she'd saved her future or signed it away. If this story made you hold your breath even once, imagine what the next chapter will do. Subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs to see what happens when Sandra's phone finally rings. 5 months passed, like a held breath slowly released. Sandra thrived in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her tuition balance showed 0. Her mother had been transferred to a private recovery facility with round-the-clock care and physical therapy that actually worked. Her grades climbed to near perfect. Her clinical instructors praised her composure under pressure, and for the first time since high school, Sandra slept through the night without waking to mental calculations of bills and balances. The phone sat in her nightstand drawer, silent and patient. She checked it occasionally at first, half expecting the white dot to flare to life, but as weeks stretched into months, the dread faded into something like cautious relief. Maybe it had been exactly what David said, a transaction, a test already passed. Maybe the debt was paid and the ledger closed. She almost convinced herself it was just a strange, lucky sponsorship, the kind of eccentric charity wealthy people sometimes engaged in to amuse themselves. She was wrong. At 3:41 a.m., on a Tuesday in early March, the white dot began to blink. The phone's vibration was soft, insistent, drilling into the silence of her small apartment like a distant alarm. Sandra woke instantly, her body recognizing the sound before her mind caught up. She fumbled for the drawer, pulled the phone out, and stared at the pulsing white light. The ringtone was a low chime, calm and relentless. She answered, "Hello?" David's voice was immediate. No greeting, no preamble. "You still have that nurse's kit?" Sandra sat up, adrenaline sharpening her thoughts. "Yes." "Good. Bring it. Don't call anyone. A car's waiting outside." The line went dead. Sandra looked at the screen, her heart hammering, then moved. She didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed her. She dressed quickly, jeans, a plain black shirt, sneakers. She grabbed the medical supply kit she kept for her clinical rotations, checked the contents by reflex: sterile gloves, suture kit, hemostatic gauze, saline, alcohol wipes, trauma shears, a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff. Everything she'd need for an emergency. Everything that suggested this was exactly that. She stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air. A black sedan idled at the curb, engine purring, windows tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian. The rear door opened as she approached. She climbed in. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The driver didn't acknowledge her, didn't speak, just pulled into the empty street and drove. The route wound through the city in ways that made no sense, doubling back through narrow alleys, passing under tunnels that seemed to stretch too long, taking corners that felt deliberately blind. Sandra recognized the pattern from crime dramas, the kind of driving meant to lose tails, to ensure no one followed, to erase the trail. Her anxiety climbed with every turn, every silent minute that stretched between her and whatever waited at the end of this ride. 20 minutes later, they stopped in front of a glass and steel skyscraper that pierced the skyline like a shard of black ice. The driver opened her door. She stepped out, kit in hand, and was ushered into a private elevator by a man in a dark suit who said nothing and watched everything. The elevator climbed in silence, the floor numbers ticking past in smooth, relentless increments. 48, 49, 50, penthouse. The doors opened onto chaos wrapped in marble and glass. Blood smeared the polished floor in dark, irregular streaks. Men in expensive suits paced like caged animals, their faces tight with controlled panic. The air smelled of copper and fear. In the center of the room, on a long glass dining table hastily cleared and covered with white sheets, a man lay bleeding. His shirt had been cut away, revealing a deep stab wound just below his rib cage, dark blood pooling beneath him, soaking through the sheets in spreading crimson blooms. David Brandon stood over him, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled tension. He looked up as Sandra entered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You wanted to help people," he said quietly. "Prove it." Sandra's hand shook as she set the kit down on the table. Her mind screamed at her to run, to refuse, to demand answers. But her training, drilled into her through countless simulations and clinical hours, kicked in like muscle memory. She snapped on gloves, her movements automatic, professional. "Towels," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Clean ones. Alcohol. I need better light. And someone get me clamps from that kit." The men moved. Even the guards, stone-faced enforcers who looked like they could break bones with a glance, obeyed. The room fell into a new rhythm, medical and urgent, organized around Sandra's clipped commands. She irrigated the wound with saline, her hands working quickly, efficiently, clearing blood to assess the damage. The laceration was deep, angled upward, dangerously close to the pericardium. One wrong move, one nicked vessel, and the man on the table would bleed out in minutes. "Who is he?" Sandra asked, not looking up. "Rico," David said. "My strategist. He's valuable." Sandra didn't respond. She focused on the wound, on the anatomy she'd memorized, on the procedures she'd practiced on mannequins and cadavers. This was real. The blood was warm. The man's breathing was shallow, labored. She worked methodically, packing the wound with hemostatic gauze, applying pressure, watching for arterial spurts that would signal catastrophic bleeding. The portable heart monitor one of the men had produced beeped steadily, then stuttered. Sandra's eyes flicked to the screen. The rhythm was erratic, dipping, struggling. She increased pressure, her jaw tight. "Hold him still," she said. "Don't let him move." David stepped closer, his presence a shadow at her shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't interfere, just watched, his gaze fixed on her hands, on her face, on every decision she made. The monitor flatlined, a single, sustained tone that cut through the room like a scream. Sandra froze for half a second, her mind racing, then moved. "Clamp," she shouted. Her voice cracked through the silence like a whip. Blood spurted from a vessel she'd missed, bright red, arterial, pulsing with each dying heartbeat. David grabbed the surgical light, angling it without being asked, his hands steady. Sandra found the vessel, clamped it, her fingers slick with blood, her breathing harsh in her own ears. She applied pressure, adjusted the clamp, and held. The monitor blipped. Once, twice. The rhythm returned, weak but present. The flat line dissolved into peaks and valleys, irregular but alive. Sandra exhaled, a shaky, trembling breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She placed two 18-gauge IV lines, spiked a bag of lactated ringers, and secured the wound with layered sutures, her hands moving on autopilot, her mind numb with exhaustion and adrenaline. Rico's chest rose and fell. His pulse steadied, the bleeding slowed to a seep, then stopped. Sandra stepped back, peeling off her gloves, her hands shaking violently now that the crisis had passed. She'd saved him. She'd brought a dying man back from the edge, in a penthouse surrounded by criminals, with nothing but a student's medical kit and sheer will. David exhaled once, a sound so quiet it was almost inaudible. "You just bought him time," he said. "I don't waste what time buys." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes unreadable, his voice calm. "And now, Miss Williams, you've bought something from me too. I pay my debts." Sandra looked at him, at Rico breathing on the table, at the blood on her hands and the men watching her like she'd just performed a miracle. She realized with cold, absolute clarity that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She wasn't just in David Brandon's ledger anymore. She was in his world. And there was no going back. If you made it this far and your heart is still racing, don't keep this to yourself. Subscribe, like, and share so someone else can feel what you just felt. Sandra stood by the penthouse window, watching dawn creep over the city in shades of gray and pale gold. Her hands were clean now, scrubbed raw in the marble bathroom sink until the water ran clear, but she could still feel the phantom weight of blood on her fingers. Behind her, Rico lay stable on the dining table, converted into a makeshift surgical bed, his breathing steady, his vitals holding. Two of David's men stood guard nearby, silent sentinels who watched her with a mixture of wariness and something that might have been respect. Exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical weight, but adrenaline still hummed through her veins, keeping sleep at a distance. She'd saved a man's life in a criminal's penthouse with a student medical kit and sheer determination. The reality of it settled over her in waves, each one colder than the last. This wasn't a clinical rotation. This wasn't a simulation. This was the world David Brandon had bought her into, the world she'd agreed to enter when she took that phone 5 months ago. Footsteps approached from behind, deliberate and unhurried. Sandra didn't need to turn to know it was David. His presence had a gravity to it, a way of bending the space around him. "You should rest," he said quietly. Sandra shook her head. "I need to monitor him for the next few hours. Watch for complications, infection, internal bleeding I might have missed." David moved to stand beside her, his gaze following hers out over the city. He reached up and unclasped the gold cross pendant from around his neck, the chain whispering against his skin as he removed it. He placed it on the windowsill between them, the cross gleaming in the early light. "For what you did tonight," he said. Sandra looked at the pendant, then at him. "I don't want payment. I did what needed to be done." David's expression remained unreadable. "It's not payment. It's acknowledgement. There's a difference." Before Sandra could respond, the intercom near the elevator buzzed, harsh and insistent. A voice crackled through, tinny and official. "Building security. We've had noise complaints from the 47th floor. We need to do a wellness check." David's men tensed immediately, hands moving toward concealed weapons. David raised one hand, a subtle gesture that froze everyone in place. He looked at Sandra. "Fix this." Sandra's mind raced. The penthouse still bore signs of the emergency, blood-stained towels in a heap, medical supplies scattered across surfaces, the metallic smell of blood lingering in the air despite the ventilation. She moved fast, her exhaustion evaporating under the pressure of immediate need. "Trash bags," she said sharply, pointing at one of the guards. "Black ones, contractor grade if you have them, and bleach wipes. Someone open those windows wider. The rest of you, clear every surface. Put anything medical in that bag. Move." The men moved. They followed her orders without question, gathering bloodied materials, wiping down surfaces, opening windows to let the cold morning air sweep through and dilute the smell. Sandra grabbed an air ionizer she spotted on a shelf and cranked it to maximum, positioning it near the dining area. She instructed 2 men to carefully move Rico into a bedroom, closing the door behind them. The intercom buzzed again. "Hello? We're coming up." David walked to the intercom, pressed the button. "One moment, I was in the shower." He looked at Sandra. She surveyed the room with a critical eye. It wasn't perfect, but it would pass a cursory inspection. She nodded. David opened the door just as 2 building security officers stepped off the elevator, both in crisp uniforms, both carrying tablets and wearing expressions of professional courtesy tinged with suspicion. One was older, with silver hair and a name tag that read Martinez. The other was younger, sharper-eyed, his hand resting casually near the radio on his belt. "Gentlemen," David said smoothly, "how can I help you?" Martinez glanced at his tablet. "We received multiple noise complaints. Shouting. Possible disturbance. We need to verify everything is all right." David stepped aside, gesturing them in with the casual confidence of someone who owned not just the penthouse, but the entire building. "Of course. Please." The officers entered, their gazes sweeping the room. Sandra stood near the kitchen island, a mug of coffee in her hand she'd poured as a prop. Her posture relaxed despite the hammering of her heart. The penthouse looked untouched, clean, quiet. The windows were open, the air fresh, no blood, no chaos, just marble and glass and the faint hum of the city waking below. Martinez's eyes lingered on Sandra. "And you are?" "A friend," Sandra said evenly. I came by early. We were discussing a project. The younger officer walked toward the closed bedroom door. What's in there? David's voice remained calm. My associate is resting. He had a long flight. I'd prefer not to disturb him. The officer's hand hovered near the doorknob. We need to check all rooms. David didn't move, but something in his stillness shifted, a quiet weight that filled the space like a dropped anchor. Of course, he said. But if you wake him, I'll need to file a formal complaint about harassment. I'm sure your supervisor would appreciate the call at 5 a.m. The officer hesitated, glanced at Martinez. Martinez checked his tablet again, then shook his head slightly. We're good here. Sorry for the disturbance, Mr. Brandon. Have a good morning. They left. The elevator doors closed. The penthouse fell silent. Sandra set the coffee mug down, her hands shaking now that the threat had passed. David walked to the window, picked up the gold cross pendant, and turned to face her. You could have walked away months ago, he said quietly. Sandra met his gaze. I still can. David studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. You won't, he said. Sandra wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but the words felt hollow. She'd crossed a line tonight. She'd used her skills to save a man bleeding out in a criminal enterprise. She'd lied to security officers. She'd become complicit. And somewhere beneath the fear and exhaustion, she felt the uncomfortable truth that she'd also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. David extended his hand, not in dominance, but in something closer to recognition. You're not in my ledger anymore, Sandra. You're in my circle. Sandra looked at his hand, at the cross pendant resting in his other palm. And what does that mean? It means I stopped testing you. She took his hand. His grip was firm, steady, a handshake that felt like a contract signed in blood and dawn light. He placed the pendant in her palm, closing her fingers around it. Back in her apartment 3 hours later, Sandra sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the gold cross gleaming against her palm. The encrypted phone lay silent on her nightstand, its white dot dark and patient. She knew it would ring again. The calls would keep coming. The tests would evolve into expectations, expectations into obligations. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror across the room. The woman staring back looked older than 23, looked like someone who'd walked through fire and come out changed. Her last thought before exhaustion finally dragged her under was a line David had spoken in the penthouse, quiet and absolute. Loyalty isn't tested once, it's monitored forever. Across the city, David stood on his own balcony. The skyline spread before him like a kingdom made of glass and steel. He spoke into another phone, his voice low and precise. Keep an eye on her. Let's see how loyal she stays when the next test begins. He ended the call. The city hummed below. And somewhere in the distance, Sandra Williams slept with a gold cross on her nightstand and a debt she could never fully repay. If Sandra's choice haunts you the way it should, don't let this story die in your feed. Subscribe, like, and share it with someone who understands that some debts are paid in pieces of yourself.